Thank you, Ashley and Joe and Louise, and good morning and welcome to all of those who are joining us online today. I have a fun little true story to tell you. Once upon a time in my other life, I lived in Winnemucca, Nevada. Now, for those of you who cannot find Winnemucca on the map, you take your Rand McNally map, and right in the center of the state, under the staple, is Winnemucca, Nevada. And Winnemucca is known for silver mines and casinos and the Paiute Indian tribe, which named the town Winnemucca, which means one moccasin. And I lived there for several years, and I ran cocktails, and I dealt 21, and I tended bar. It was my ministerial education. Just in case you want to know my resume. Well, one day I decided that I needed to go to the bank, and that was kind of odd because when you live in a casino town, the casino is the bank. You really don't need to go to the bank, but for some reason, I decided that I had to go to the bank. So I trot myself around the corner to the First National Bank of Winnemucca, one of those grand old granite buildings, you know, when you think of bank with the bars on the windows. And I walked in, and I look over to the left, and there's this almost shrine. It's a display of some nature. And I walked a little closer, and there was a picture, a small picture, of 5 cowboys. And of course, if you have 5 cowboys, you have to have a horse in the picture too. And a letter that was addressed to George Nixon, the bank manager, saying, "Thank you. We are enjoying spending your money." Signed, Butch Cassidy. You can Google it. The First National Bank of Winnemucca was robbed on September 19th, 1900. They got $30,000, mostly in gold, and they dashed toward the border. Now, what's interesting about this letter, because I know you're thinking, how has this got to do with anything? But you should know I have an answer to that. Letters, and especially ancient letters, are very important. Because not only do they tell us about a communication between people, but they tell us a little bit about the people and the situation and circumstances. There was a myth for many years that Butch Cassidy was kind of a jokester. Well, I would say that that letter proved conclusively that Butch Cassidy did have a pretty good sense of humor, kind of a wry sense of humor, but a sense of humor nonetheless. And so when we look at these letters of Paul that we have been studying over the course of this month, we not only learn about Paul and what he says, but we learn about his language, we learn about his culture, we learn about his thought, we learn about the things that are troubling him, we learn about so many diverse things in reading his letters. Something that I want all of you to understand is that Paul's letters, the 7 authentic letters of Paul, many are attributed to him in the New Testament that are not his, but the 7 authentic letters of Paul are what we call occasional letters. In other words, there was some occasion which prompted him to write. Now, sometimes it was a messenger and said, you know, Paul, you've got to answer this question. Or he was thinking about something that someone had said to him, and he thought, well, I better write to them and explain it. And so these letters that we have today are really treasured. You know, as funny as the story of the Butch Cassidy letter, today you can go to the First National Bank in Winnemucca and the letter is still there. It, of course, is brought out on Butch Cassidy days in September every year. But, you know, you think about how precious those letters of Paul were to those congregations. Here's something interesting that you may not realize. But until about the year 300, letters were never, not only letters, but anything, was never read silently. People did not read silently because, not that they couldn't read, but because so few people could read, that when a letter from Paul came, someone stood up and said, here is a letter from Paul, and he says, and they would read it out loud. So if you ever want to really up your Bible study, read the letter out loud. There's a cadence, there's a rhythm to it. But what we know about these letters is that they're sort of telling us about his history, telling us about what's going on. And we get a kind of glimpse into the window of early Christianity. Now remember what I said. The authentic letters of Paul predate the Gospels. How many did your reading assignment? Oh, I'm so impressed, you know. And the reading assignment, for those of you who didn't know, is to read the last 2 chapters of Romans and immediately, without a break, read the first 2 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. There's a 15-year difference in them. And also what you notice is the languaging. It's almost like he's talking about 2 different people. Except for the word Jesus, you wouldn't really get that Paul and Mark were talking about the same person. And this is the thing I want you to understand. The letters of Paul speak to his experience, his mystical experience. It was not an experience shared by the early disciples or the first disciples. Conversely, the first disciples walked and talked and ate and worked with Jesus, which was not something that Paul shared. Paul never met Jesus. So there's these 2 streams. You know, when you say, what is Christianity? Well, that's a complicated answer. And I think what I hope that you saw in just those 4 chapters is how complicated it gets. The early disciples of Jesus were Jewish, were perfectly happy to remain Jewish. It was nice if some Gentiles came in and followed what they were teaching, but they were not seeking Gentile converts. On the other hand, Paul, although a Jew himself, he saw this message of the resurrected Lord, as he would call it, the Lord Jesus Christ, Christ Jesus, he uses those terms quite interchangeably. He saw that this was a universal message. This was not just for the Jews. It was for Jew and Gentile alike. And next month, when we start talking about this idea and concept of the universal Christ, you will see that there is a firm foundation. You see, some people say, well, that's not in Christianity. It is a firm foundation in Christianity about this concept of the resurrected Lord, of the universal Christ. The challenge we all are getting, I hope you're kind of getting attuned to, is that because we have tamed Paul, we have lost the power and poignancy of what he said. In other words, the taming happened when we built the structure of the New Testament, we put the Gospels first, and then we put the letters to Paul, as if there was a natural bridge, as if there was some sort of theological unfolding to Paul. But that is not what happened. Paul predates it all. Paul arrived on the scene maybe 5 years after Jesus. He knew many of the early disciples by name, by sight, by sound. He didn't agree with them, but we know that he was back and forth to Jerusalem several times. He finally settled in Antioch, and for many, many years, about 12 to 14, depending on how you date it, he was in Antioch living and preaching and growing this thing called Christianity. Because his focus and his ideas were this universal Christ that is for all. And so we saw the Antioch community grow in its Gentile converts, so much so that head office, so to speak, in Jerusalem sent Peter up to find out what was going on up there. And there was a lot of tension over the situation. Until finally, although Paul makes it sound like he had a big idea and plans and this town couldn't hold me anymore, what really happened is they said, there's the door, don't let it hit you on the way out. And so Paul began to preach across all of Asia Minor with a mission, with an intention that if he could just get to Rome, he would convert the empire, and he was right. It is the Christianity that we know a lot more about today than the Gnostics or the Ebionites, or the Marcionites, or the Proto-Orthodox. We know much more about the Pauline sort of framework of Christianity than any. So last week we began to look at the letters themselves, and we looked at the first two letters, and I gave you a handout of how to read the Bible historically, not theologically. And the handout is out in the foyer about reading the 7 letters of Paul first, then going to the Gospels, to Luke, Acts, and then finally to the Gospel of John. So that is the historical context in which all of these letters are happening. So you get a different feel and a different flavor. But a lot of the early letters of Paul, again, like the letter to Butch Cassidy, tells you a little bit more about what's going on. So we looked at the letter to the Thessalonians and found out that Paul is making theology up on the run. Now, this is, we can kind of go, what? Folks, there was no Christianity then. There was no New Testament. Paul, wait a minute, I'm going to check the New Testament and see what it says. There was no New Testament. There was no theological thought. The reason the other groups, the Gnostics, the Ebionites, the Proto-Orthodox, the reason we don't know about them is there was no leader. Paul said, I'm going to be the leader of this group, and I'm going to spread this message as I see it, and that's why we know about it. And not only was he going to spread that message, he was going to write about it. And we have these written documents. Now, let me say, they have never literally been found. Okay, it's not like some museum in the basement or the Vatican. I always love that, the poor Vatican. In the basement of the Vatican, they have Paul's letters. Probably they've disintegrated long ago. But this idea that Paul has, he's working out his experience. That's what I want you to hear. He's working out an experience that he cannot understand, that is so foreign to his upbringing, his understanding, his religion, his belief. He just struggles with it constantly. And the basic struggle is this. In the book of Deuteronomy, it says that a man hung on a tree is accursed by God. Well, what happened to Jesus? He was hung on a tree. Therefore, in Paul's mind, he was accursed of God. But when Paul had his mystical experience, suddenly Paul realized that he wasn't accursed by God. He was the one and only that was blessed by God. He was the one that was going to ultimately lead the resurrection, the second resurrection of the faithful. And so that's the framework that Paul starts coming from. So we saw in the first letter to the Thessalonians, the second letter is not an authentic Pauline letter. The first letter to the Thessalonians, we saw that he's working this out because the Thessalonians don't get it. They're saying, listen, Paul, this is great. You told us that it has to be people that are alive when Jesus comes back. What about the faithful who have died? Paul's like, that's a good question. And then he comes up with this brilliant answer. Well, on the way back, Jesus is going to pick up the faithful dead, and then he's going to come up, and he's going to pick up the faithful alive, and we'll all get together and go, and we will ascend together. See, he's developing theology as he goes. Okay? And today we think, well, that's what Paul said. But it's right at that moment, he had to really work that out. The second thing we saw in the letter to the Galatians, that although the book of Acts would love us to believe that everything was sweetness and light in the early church, that it was not. And Paul was really hot at the churches of Galatia because he felt they were going to that other gospel. Well, what was that other gospel? He tells us that people were going to Judaism. Gentiles were converting to Judaism. Remember, where were those disciples coming from? They were Jesus' disciples too. But they believed in their Judaism and didn't want Gentiles living a separate life from the Jewish roots that Jesus was. So they said, listen, I know we love Paul. He's a nice guy, but he's a little bit misdirected. You all need to be Jews. And they're like, really? Let me think about what that means. And Paul's saying, no, 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 no. By your baptism, you have already gone past the need for some ritualistic circumcision. You have been circumcised in the heart, picking up from Jeremiah in the Old Testament. You've been circumcised in the heart, and there's no reason for you to be circumcised in the flesh. So the letter to the Galatians was hotly contested. So today we're looking at, or tells about the contest externally to Paul's churches. Today we're going to look at the Corinthians and see the conflict that's internal to the churches. Now, Corinth, being on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, not too far away from Athens, was a very prosperous and affluent city. Because of the fact it had so much commercial traffic and it was a stronghold of the Roman Empire, it was a big city, it was a prosperous city, it was a multicultural city. And Paul comes there with his message and he creates this quite large church. But in having a quite large church, there also comes quite large problems that comes with it, even in our day. So Paul, we see these letters to the Corinthians. Now, in our Bible, it says there's 2. What we historically know is there are at least 4, if not 5. The letter we see today as 1 Corinthians is actually the second of a series of letters that Paul wrote, probably from Ephesus, where he lived for some time. So he's trying to get these people to straighten up and fly right, is what he's doing. But here's the issue, one of the issues that the Corinthians had. Since we've been baptized, and we're just kind of hanging around waiting for Jesus to come back, it really doesn't matter what we do. See, there was one man that was sleeping with his father's wife. Doesn't matter what we do. Paul didn't think that was quite right. And there was all kinds of sexual abuse. Paul didn't think that was quite right. If you're waiting for the Lord, then you need to be sanctified at all times. You need to be anticipatory of the moment when Jesus is coming back, which we do not know what that time or place was. And that we would be awaiting the arrival by doing what is ours to do, our jobs, taking care of our families, taking care of our crops, but always with the understanding that at any minute now, we must stay sanctified because Jesus is coming back. We see in the letter, this particular letter, there's a lot of different kinds of abuses that Paul is really upset about. But the one he's upset about the most is how communion is handled. Now let's talk about what the Lord's Supper is. When Jesus had his Last Supper, it was a Passover Seder. Jesus was a Jew. They went to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. Passover is a meal that is highly symbolic. Even today, we had a Passover ritual a couple years ago here, and you do a reading, and you have special food, and you have a reading, and you do a prayer, and it's not like mac and cheese and a glass of wine. It's very, very ritualized. And so what happens is this ultimately becomes Jesus' Last Supper. Now think about it. When you have someone die unexpectedly, as they did, there's something about that last time you were together, whether it was a meal or they were in the playground with you or something, and all of a sudden life has just taken the rug and gone, and you begin to ritualize that last time together. If it's a meal, for example, you say things like, in honor of Harry, we're going to have Harry's favorite burgers on the anniversary of his death. And every anniversary of death, we always have burgers. Somebody doesn't even know why you're having burgers, but it's the anniversary of the death. And so you do something that commemorates. So shifting now to the Corinthians. In the early years, communion was simply a potluck Sunday. It's obvious from the writing. That's what's happening. Everybody brings something. The problem is those who came first ate everything. And not only did they eat everything, they drank everything as well. So by the time the workers got out of the field to come to the potluck supper, the communion, the food was gone and everybody was drunk. Paul thought there was something wrong with that program. He said, if we're all supposed to be in this communion together, then you've got to honor this. It isn't just dinner, it's a sacred moment. So Paul is admonishing them. He says, and I love this part, if you're hungry, eat at home before you come. A practical man, indeed. All right, so in his letter to the Corinthians, he says, chapter 17, for I have received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and blessed it and said, this is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. 15 years later, Mark writes, while they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, take, this is my body. Then he took the cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them to drink from it. And he said, all of you drink from it. And he said, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for many. Almost word for word. Who wrote first? Paul. Who made the ritual of communion? See, we tend to think of it as who? It came from the Gospels, and therefore it's direct connect Jesus. It is not direct connect Jesus. It is the actual realization that through the course of time, this last meal, this Passover Seder of Jesus, that is specific and traditionally Jewish, is morphing into something new and different for Gentile converts that have no connection and no relation to Judaism at all. The same rituals and the same prayers and all of that has been transformed into new rituals and new understandings. See, this is how when we look at the Gospels first and then we look at Paul, we don't get the impact of how Christianity is evolving. Okay? Something new is happening here. Something different is shifting. And so as Paul begins this journey, it's not that they, let me step back and say, I use the word intentionally evolving, because it's probably true that in the city of Antioch, before Paul left, remember he was there for almost 14 years, it sort of evolved in Antioch, okay? Because in Antioch, we see the swing. Now we're not so much Jewish, maybe 50-50. Now we're 25-75. Now we're like 90-10. So we see the shifting in Antioch, but not as profound as in churches like Corinth, which was almost 100% Gentile. Somehow I've got to talk to my Gentile congregation. They are not going to understand when I start talking about Moses and the Red Sea. They're not going to understand the stories and rituals of people passing over in a wilderness. They're going to understand that the resurrected Lord, when we set aside the food, when we stop and have this ritual moment, Paul believed with such intensity that the resurrected Lord would be present in that moment. And that's where we see, when you read, especially Corinthians, you see that blessings are happening. People's lives are being healed. We see lots of speaking in tongues and prophesying. All of that is happening because the early church really, truly believed that the essence and the mystical moment of the risen Lord was alive and present there with them. And you know, I feel This is what Christianity has lost. We've put the story in the closet. But Jesus is just alive as the resurrected Lord right here and right now. This is a holy moment. Your lives are being changed. But all you go out and say, well, that was a nice sermon, whatever it was she was talking. You really got to grapple with it. When does God become present to you? Tuesday at noon? Or right now? That's what Paul was trying to say. The experience of the resurrected Lord is right now. And we encourage it by coming together to worship, to sing songs. You read Corinthians, it's all there, to worship together, to sing songs. And then at some moment, we pause. We pick up the bread and we break it. And in the breaking it, the mystical sense and presence of the risen Lord is present to us. So it's interesting for us to grapple with history, because you and I have all been raised with a understanding of Christianity as this is the way it always was. This is the way it will always be. But it is something that's evolving, something that was thought and prayed about, something that was revealed, something that moved, something that shifted with each passing era, with each passing new understanding and insight. And no one was more certain and no one was more clear about his passion and his purpose to articulate and leave for us the message of the resurrected Lord as Paul the Apostle. So your reading assignment, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and next week we're going to be talking about his finest work, and that is the letter to the Romans. Thank you for joining me today, and God bless.